All right, guys, this is part two of the endocrine system, and we're going to just keep going talking about calcitonin and PTH. So, calcitonin, you can see up here at the top. So, what happens is that calcitonin is actually released by the thyroid gland, and it does that in response to rising blood calcium levels. So, the thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. The calcitonin is going to stimulate the calcium salt deposits into the bone. Now, if you remember osteoblasts, those are the ones that are building up that bone matrix. So it's going to stimulate the bone matrix building. So we're going to add in that calcium. On the other hand, when we have falling blood calcium levels, then that's going to stimulate those parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone or PTH. PTH is going to cause the osteoclasts to degrade the bone matrix so that we can release that calcium from the bone back into the blood. So the adrenal glands are actually formed by two different glands. So those adrenal glands, we have two different parts to them. We have the cortex. The cortex is going to be that outer glandular region. That outer glandular region can be further divided into three zones. We call them the inside layers called the zona reticularis. Then we have the zona fasciculata and then the zona glomerulosa. And then the medulla is going to be interneural tissue. Those adrenal glands are going to sit directly on top of the kidneys. So we have these mineral corticoids. And mineral corticoids, the most common one that we talk about here is aldosterone. And these are produced in that outer adrenal cortex within the zona glomerulosa. Okay, and these help to regulate mineral balance. That's called why they're called mineral corticoids. So aldosterone helps to regulate that mineral balance. It helps to regulate the mineral content in our blood, the water, and then any electrolyte balance. The target organ here is going to be the kidney itself, and the production is going to be stimulated by renin, but inhibited by atrial natriuretic peptide. So aldosterone helps to regulate our blood volume, blood pressure, sodium, potassium, and our hydrogen ions within blood. So what do you think is the effect of aldosterone? It's released during times of dehydration, sodium deficiency, or decreased blood volume. What do you think? Okay. So this is called the RAA pathway. Okay, it's the renin angiotensin aldosterone pathway. And you're going to see this come up several times. So I encourage you to sort of go ahead and start practicing drawing it and getting it memorized. So remember, aldosterone helps to regulate our blood volume, blood pressure, and our levels of sodium, potassium, and our hydrogen ions in our blood. So if we have dehydration or sodium deficiency, or we have a hemorrhage, okay, that causes a decrease in our blood volume and therefore a decrease in our blood pressure. That's going to activate what are called our JGA cells of our kidneys. They're called juxtaglomerular cells within our kidneys. That's going to cause an increase of renin. At the same time, our liver is always producing this substance called angiotensinogen. That gen at the end is for that word genesis, the beginning. So it's the first one, angiotensinogen. It's being released kind of all the time. Now, when the renin comes into contact with that angiotensinogen, it's going to cleave it into angiotensin 1 or ANG1, we often call it. Now, that's going to cause that angiotensin in our lungs. Our lungs have an enzyme within them called angiotensin converting enzyme or ACE. Okay, that's going to convert ANG1 into ANG2. Okay, so all of that has happened, right? So we have our Ang2. Okay. Now, Ang2 is actually going to act on our adrenal cortex so that we can release aldosterone. Okay. So remember that was that mineral corticoid that we talked about for aldosterone. Now, also that Ang2 acts on our arterioles. It causes some vasoconstriction. So that aldosterone in our kidneys is going to increase the sodium and the water reabsorption. So we're going to pull it out of our urine and we're going to reabsorb the sodium and the water because we're having dehydration. And if we're having dehydration, we don't want to let the water and our sodium out within our urine. We want to pull it back in because the water is going to follow the salt. Okay. And we're going to increase the secretion of our potassium ions and our hydrogen ions into our urine. We can get more acidic. Okay. Now, by increasing our sodium and water reabsorption, pulling it back back into our urine. We're concentrating it more fully. And so that's going to help us to increase our blood volume. We also, with that ANG2, are vasoconstricting our arterioles, meaning that we're going to have less blood flowing within our arterioles. And so that's going to cause our blood pressure to go back to normal. Okay, now we also have an increase in our potassium within our extracellular fluid right here at our adrenal cortex. Okay, so let's keep talking about those hormones of the adrenal cortex. We also have glucocorticoids. Okay, glucocorticoids help to regulate our glucose metabolism. So they're the ones that start with cortisol, corticosteroid, or cortisone. Okay? They're produced within that middle layer, which is called the zona fasciculata. They promote our normal cell metabolism and they help to resist any long term stressors. They're released in response to our increased blood levels of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Mommy. Yes, baby. What you doing? I'm working. Can I have your phone? So the hormones of our adrenal medulla is that we're going to produce two similar hormones here. We have our catecholamines. Those catecholamines are the epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine. Those hormones are going to prepare the body to deal with short-term stress. They're also a part of our sympathetic response of our nervous system. You see this released then. Okay. And here is just a summary of each one. Now, don't forget to look at this chemical class as to whether or not we're going to need a second messenger system or not, right? So these are steroid, aldosterone, as well as our cortisol, corticosteroids, and the cortisone. Remember also we're going to have our sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone are in the steroid class. And then everything else is going to be an amine. So what we want to look at here is our stress response. So this is our short-term stress response. So our hypothalamus is actually going to start the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. This should sound really familiar because this is our sympathetic nervous system, sort of everything that you remember about sympathetic nervous system, that's happening right here. Okay, short-term stress response. We're going to see sympathetic nervous system. So it just like what would you imagine is going to happen to your body when you are under short-term stress? You're being attacked by a lion, a tiger, or a bear. Oh my. Okay, we're going to increase our heart rate, increase our blood pressure. Our liver is going to convert our glycogen to glucose and release that glucose in the blood because we're going to need to have that glucose to be able to utilize it for our muscles so that we can fight off or we can fly off, right? This is our fight or flight response. We're going to have a change in our blood flow pattern so we can have an increase of alertness, decreased digestion and kidney activity because we don't need to be digesting our food or making urine when we're being attacked by a lion, tiger, or bear. We are also going to increase our metabolic rate here. Okay? Now, during a more prolonged response, we're going to have the hypothalamus releasing hormones to our anterior pituitary, which is going to cause the release of ACTH. Okay, the ACTH is going to act on our adrenal cortex, and we're going to see the release of our mineralocorticoids and our glucocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids is going to have to do with our aldosterone, right? So we're going to retain that sodium in the water by the kidneys. We're going to increase our blood volume and blood pressure. Glucocorticoids, the proteins and the fats are going to be converted into glucose. So we're going to be building up new glucose, gluconeogenesis, or we can break them down into energy. We're going to increase our blood sugar, and we're going to suppress our immune system. Okay, short-term stress response, long-term stress response. Now, let's talk about the pancreas. Within our pancreas, we have our pancreatic islets. The pancreas is what we call a mixed gland. Within the islets, the pancreas produces hormones. So we have insulin and we have glucagon. So insulin allows glucose, which is our blood sugar, right, to cross the plasma membranes into our cells from our beta cells. So beta cells create that insulin. What does that mean for our blood glucose levels, right? Insulin is released after we eat when our blood glucose levels are high. Now the insulin can bind to receptor and the glucose can move into the cell to be used for cellular respiration. Flip side, glucagon. That allows the glucose to enter the blood. This is released from our alpha cells within the pancreatic islets. What does glucagon do for our blood glucose levels? Well, glucagon is released during times of fasting. Okay, so when we haven't eaten for a while, we're getting a little hungry, blood sugar drops, right? And so that happens. Now the glucose is going to be able to get into our cells. So we're going to activate gluconeogenesis or glycolysis so that we can break down the glycogen. Okay, sorry, glycogenolysis. Misspoke. The hormones are antagonists to one another and they help to maintain our blood sugar homeostasis. The pancreatic islets, you can see them right here, they're shown in that little blue part, right? Because the pancreas is a digestive um, structure as well, right? So that's why we call it mixed. Here's the alpha cells and the beta cells right there. Okay. So this is just showing you our insulin response to hyperglycemia or high blood sugars. Make sure you take a look at that in your textbook. This is hypoglycemia for low blood sugar. Also take a look at that in your textbook. And then this is showing you our different hormones of the pancreas. So we talked about insulin and glucagon. We also have somatostatin. That's going to inhibit both insulin and glucagon release. And then PP, which is pancreatic polypeptide, you also sometimes see it as PPP, is a protein and it has to do with our appetite. Okay. The thymus is located posterior to the sternum or sort of sits on top of the heart. It's largest in infants and children and it produces what's called thymosin. Thymosin is going to help to mature some types of white blood cells and it's important in developing our immune system. These are reproductive hormones, so the gonads are both testes and ovaries, as well as the placenta is considered technically a gonad, but you would only have a placenta if you were pregnant. So testes in males, ovaries and placenta found in females. Okay, so in the case of the testes, they're going to release testosterone and inhibin. Okay, now you can see here that testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are the steroids. Okay, and then inhibin and HCG are going to be proteins. Okay, so testosterone is going to stimulate the development of male secondary sex characteristics. What are secondary sex characteristics? Those are the characteristics that identify as a male or a female. So physical characteristics, this would be like the growing of facial hair, thickening of hair in the pubic area, um, under the arms, on the arms themselves, a wider chest, narrower hips, right? And so female secondary sex characteristics would be the development of breasts, a sort of widening of the hips, so things that you would expect to see for a female as they move through puberty, okay? And then the testes are also secreting that inhibin, which is a protein, meaning that it's going to need that second messenger system, cyclic AMP. And that's going to inhibit our FSH release from the pituitary. And then placenta, when we're pregnant, we're going to release HCG or human chorionic gonadotropin. That is a protein and it promotes the progesterone synthesis during pregnancy and it inhibits the immune response against the fetus. So estrogens are produced by Graafian follicles. They're also produced by the placenta during pregnancy. They stimulate the development of those secondary female characteristics. They help to mature our female reproductive organs, so the uterus and the ovaries. Helps to prepare the uterus to receive a fertilized egg. This has to do with the menstrual cycle. Helps to maintain pregnancy and prepares the breast to produce milk. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is what's going to surround the ovulating egg. And we'll talk about that when we get to the reproductive system. It acts with estrogen to bring about the menstrual cycle and it helps in the implantation of an embryo in the uterus. The interstitial cells of the testes are hormone producing. And so if you wouldn't have had lab yet, but when we talk about interstitial cells, so the testes has different tubes, and then between those tubes, you find what are called interstitial cells. Those interstitial cells are the ones that are producing the hormones. They produce several androgens, specifically, testosterone is the most important androgen for males. It's responsible for those adult male secondary sex characteristics, promotes the growth and the maturation of the male reproductive system, like the descent of the testes and the development of the penis, and then it's required for sperm cell production. And then the placenta. So again, this is only going to be the case during pregnancy, but they produce hormones that maintain the pregnancy. They can, some of those hormones can play a part in the delivery of the baby. Specifically, they produce HCG in addition to estrogen, progesterone, and other hormones. HCG is what is detected in home pregnancy tests. Okay? These are some organs that have some secondary endocrine functions, but they are not necessarily considered an endocrine gland. For instance, the heart actually releases ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, and so it does this in response to a high blood pressure. So it reduces our blood volume, blood pressure, and our sodium concentration. Okay. The gastrointestinal tract is going to release gastrin, secretin, and CCK, which helps to digest food. It also releases GIP and GLP-1. They stimulate the beta cells to release insulin. The kidneys release renin, which helps to stimulate that release of aldosterone. Remember, that's part of that RAA pathway. The kidneys also release calcitriol, which is going to aid in the absorption of calcium. And the kidneys release EPO, with this erythropoietin, and that helps to trigger the formation of cells within the bone marrow. These are some more. I'm not going to go over all of them with you, but I do encourage you to read through them, please. Okay. The developmental aspects of the endocrine system. Most of our endocrine organs do operate pretty smoothly until old age. However, there are some issues. For instance, menopause. Menopause is brought about by the lack of efficiency of the ovaries, and we get a problem associated with reduced estrogen, like hot flashes. Okay. Growth hormone production is going to decline with age, as we're no longer growing up or taller or longer. We're no longer building that functional muscle mass, hence the reason that we should be exercising throughout our lifespan. And many endocrine glands are going to decrease their output with age. This is diabetes mellitus. So diabetes mellitus means that is just diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. So type 1, most commonly, we're going to find that the pancreas does not produce the insulin, and therefore the glucose cannot enter into the cells because there's no insulin to bind to that insulin receptor. For type 2, there is insulin being produced by the pancreas, but unfortunately, on the cells themselves, they're not responding to that insulin properly, meaning that they may not have an insulin receptor, or the insulin receptor may be damaged in some way, or it may be bound in another way. And so that maintains a higher glucose level, so the blood sugar levels go up too high. These are some effects that happen with growth hormone. So, a lack of growth hormone is going to cause pituitary dwarfism, and an excess of growth hormone is going to cause gigantism. There are some abnormalities of the thyroid that can occur. So we have cretinism. Cretinism is seen here in the center. That's an abnormal thyroid development. You're going to see a short, stocky body type. Severe hypothyroidism can also cause mental retardation, or a delay in development mentally. Myxedemia is when we have hypothyroidism in adults. It can cause lethargy, which is extreme fatigue, weight gain, and loss of hair. And then we can also talk about some Graves' disease. Graves' disease is hyperthyroidism, and hyperthyroidism is going to cause exophthalmic goiter and edema behind the eyes. It's going to cause some bulging. You'll see that right here within the eyes, hyperactivity, arrhythmias within the heart. Okay, this is a simple goiter there. You can see it's a swelling within the neck. There's also Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and Hashimoto's thyroiditis is indicated, it's an autoimmune disorder, and we'll see that it actually affects the follicle cells. So if I back it up to those thyroid follicles that we talked about, here we go. It's actually going to degrade that follicle cavity. And so without having that follicle cavity means that we can't hold that thyroglobin in there, which means that it's not going to contain that T3 and T4 to be able to be released. And therefore we see a decrease in T3 and T4. All right. And our next disorder would be acromegaly. And so this is an excess production of growth hormone. The growth plates of the bone have closed, and so since the growth plates in the bone have closed, we're not going to see an increase in height, but we do see an increase in the feet, the hands, and the face. They're going to become heavier in appearance with time. And then there's Addison's disease. Addison's disease occurs when we have ACTH accumulating, and it's going to cause a stimulation of the melanocytes. The melanocytes are going to, remember, those are the ones that are making melanin within the skin, so it gives it a darker skin tone. Without the cortisol, there's no mobilization of that glucose under stress. It can actually be life-threatening during stressful situation, and it can cause hyperkalemia, which is it's supposed to say hypokalemia, which is low blood calcium, and it can lead to cardiac arrest. And there's Cushing syndrome. syndrome. So Cushing syndrome is when we have a hypersecretion of that adrenal cortex hormones. Cortisol is the primary problem here. It's going to cause diabetes mellitus from that increase of blood glucose. Subcutaneous fat gets deposited within the midsection, and we also see a high blood pressure. So, general adaptation syndrome or GAS is actually the body's resistance to stress. Okay, and so we have different phases of GAS or this general adaptation syndrome. So, phase one is this alarm reaction. We get a sudden activation of the sympathetic nervous system, right? Fight or flight. We're getting ready for phase two. Phase two is called resistance. So we face that challenge. Our body temperature, blood pressure, and our respiration rate, they're going to stay really high, but we can actually start to wear ourselves out. And then phase three is exhaustion. This is when we are more vulnerable to illness, collapse, or even death. And it can get pretty severe, right? So the alarm phase, fight or flight, immediate short-term response to crises. We release epinephrine and norepinephrine. We increase our heart rate and our respiratory rate. We increase the energy or the metabolism use by all of our cells. We see changes within our circulation, and that's going to increase our blood pressure. And we mobilize our glucose reserves. Okay. During the resistance phase, this is when we're going to see the mineral corticoids being released, as well as the glucocorticoids, right? So the mineralocorticoids is aldosterone, glucocorticoids are all those ones that start with cortisol, so cortisol, cortisone, right? So we're going to continue to see that elevation of our blood glucose concentrations. We're going to see a higher level of our blood pressure, and then we can get to that exhaustion phase. Now, this is a severe exhaustion phase. This is actually someone who is starving, and so their body is under extreme stress. Okay, so at this point, the body's lipids reserves are no longer sufficient. They cannot maintain that resistance phase any further, and so we hit that exhaustion phase. So without immediate corrective actions, we're going to see failure of one or more of those organ systems, which is going to prove to be fatal. Okay. So what I would like you guys to do is to make sure that you can review these, describe the functions of the endocrine system, categorize the groups of hormones on a molecular basis, how do each of them get into the cells, and then what kind of action is going to cause. Review the stimulus, the target, and the actions of those structures identified as our endocrine glands, and then describe any abnormal endocrine function. So I encourage you to pause this and see if that's something that you can do on your own before moving forward. Okay. So these are some pathways of the hormones. Okay. And so you can see that the hypothalamus is going to release these hormones, which are then going to act on the pituitary. Okay. So in the case of ADH and oxytocin, they're both stored in the posterior pituitary to be released later. Gonadal releasing hormone is going to act on FSH and LH. Um, CRF, which is cortico-releasing factor, is going to cause ACTH to release. Thyroid-releasing hormone is going to cause TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone, to release. Dopamine actually is going to cause the release of prolactin. It's going to stop the release of prolactin. My apologies. And then growth hormone-releasing hormone is going to cause the release of growth hormone. And you can see these are the hormones are where they're going to act, and then the hormones that are going to be released. Okay. So remember humoral control of the hormones, so that's going to mean the blood levels, right? So blood glucose, blood potassium levels, so insulin, glucagon, aldosterone, these are all going to be humoral control. We have neural control, like the CRH, the corticotropin releasing hormone, causing that release of ACTH. Okay. I encourage you to take a look at the difference between glands and nerves. Okay, so there's the endocrine system and the nervous system. What are the differences for them? And then I encourage you to be able to fill in this chart. Okay? If you have any questions, please let me know. I am happy to help.